with regards to how superwisdom as such comes to be, it's a difficult thing to build, because what we imagine it would do is that it would be able to develop new values as it encounters new situations. Because otherwise it would just be artificial general wisdom. But superwisdom implies that it's actually wiser than any other person. So it has to learn new values like we do when we encounter new situations. We grapple with some tension, and then we learn some new way of dealing with similar situations.
I'm really interested in the potential of AI for good. And I wanted to invite you to get the ball rolling by articulating for the audience how you define AI for good, or even benevolent AI today in 2024.
Sure. The mission of our institute is to create something we call wise AI. Sometimes we call it super wise AI. And what we mean by that is a very concrete thing, because wisdom can be a very fluffy word. But what we mean is an AI that understands which values applies in which context. And super wisdom is kind of the North Star, which is a value that's wiser than any person that's alive. And you could try that by can it create win-win solutions that no person could solve, that no humans could solve. Yeah, that's sort of our the way we think about benevolent AI is like wise AI.
That's really useful for me, because it's the first time in this series that any of our guests have been not just thinking about wisdom as a manifestation of benevolence or an interpretation of benevolence, but also working in really concrete terms to explore the pathways to achieving wisdom or finding wisdom. And we'll dive into that at some depth today. But I also, maybe before that, wanted to extend from that earlier conversation about how we define AI for good, to also maybe invite you to reflect or share with the audience your own interpretation of this idea of the AI revolution. You said something about AI for good as maybe wise or super wise AI. How do you think about defining the AI revolution from your desk today in 2024?
I guess the kind of AI revolution we are most concerned with is AI is replacing a bunch of key roles in society, and AI being integrated very deeply into society, and that will upheaval a bunch of things. And what we're mostly concerned with is AIs that are not values-driven, that are not wise, that don't have a sense of human wisdom, replacing humans in kind of key decision-making pipelines in, for instance, the military, or running companies and hedge funds, where humans often tend to do, to a large extent, the ethical thing, even if their incentives are aligned differently. And AIs that are not aligned to a broad notion of human values will only do as they're told. So this is the issue that we're mostly concerned with. How can we create wise AIs and implement it into society in such a way that we don't have an AI revolution that leads to a bunch of chaos, because these artificial sociopaths, as we like to call them, replace humans and leads to havoc.
Thank you. That's actually really helpful and wonderful framing. So as we roll into this conversation, I do want to introduce the audience to some of your work. One of the terms that you've used, if I'm doing this correctly, is big data virtue ethics.
Yeah.
And you explained that virtue ethics as an idea has a fair amount of antecedent work. There's a fair amount of history to that term. Maybe before we dive into how it's relevant to AI, could you say a few words about how virtue ethics came to you, and a little bit in the broad strokes about the history of the idea?
Sure. I guess virtue ethics comes all the way back to Aristotle, really, is the one who formulated this I guess, tradition in terms of ethics. The way we came to the idea is, mainly this was the work by my co-founder, who quite early on set out to try to answer the question, what's worth maximizing? And this is a pretty deep question that led him to a lot of philosophy and sociology readings. And there are different kind of answers in different ethical theories to like what you should maximize. Utilitarianism, for instance, thinks that you should maximize utility. There's a bunch of problems with that Amartya Sen points out. And virtue ethics, we see that as a kind of a good basis, because it cuts closer to what we really care about. There are some problems with the classical formulation of virtues. Most notably, there is no good sense of where they come from. We mostly rely on two big philosophers called Ruth Chang and Charles Taylor, which have a lot to say about how you can make values, as we call it, but virtues, as Aristotle would call it, very concrete, such that we can elicit what people value by interviewing them, either in person or through an LLM.
Let's take it from the history to your application. Let's jump in here. Outside of the experiments that you've been developing on within the ecosystem of OpenAI, you clearly have come to that work motivated by experience and contact with a couple of different sectors of the digital economy. When you were first reaching out to OpenAI and saying, we want to do this project, I'm sure at that stage you made a pitch to say that we want to do this project because it's going to have immediate utility or immediate application in these handful of really pressing work areas. Could you share one or two of those with us in terms of where you thought the work would have immediate application?
Sure. Well, so it probably won't be that applicable to things that are very practical. So a lot of ChatGPT conversations, for instance, are about like, how do I write this piece of code, or or a factual question. And these questions are not so values laden. But there are questions that are more about giving life advice, that it would be very good if the model had a better sense of what your values are. Currently, if you ask it, for instance, kind of a tricky topic like something heavy about like what should I do with my life, etc., etc., it will just give you kind of a rough bullet point list, which is not so useful. So there, it would be better to have some sort of values-based model. So I see the immediate applications would be kind of life advice, coaching, therapy kind of applications. In the sort of medium term, one area that we're super excited about is replacing kind of recommender systems and social media with some sort of values-based LLMs. Because these systems are about trying to match people together. And currently they do that by other means than values. And we think that we could build a system that could match people together based on what they value, what they find meaning in. That would be a really, really cool application with a lot of low-hanging fruits that you could start with right now, and a lot of sort of long-term implications as well.
That's a far cry from Superwisdom reshaping military decision-making.
Sure.
So I want to invite you to maybe share a little bit about how you feel that Superwisdom, as it manifests virtue intelligent processing within advanced AI and then ultimately intelligent AI. How do you think it will evolve towards larger applications? How does it move from coaching to hedge fund management, military decision-making, policy advice? How do you think that's going to manifest?
I mean, it's very hard to say. We don't know how things will play out, but you will kind of like piecemeal replace one person in a company with an AI, and then one person or one employee with an AI, and then you will see other kind of AI-only companies spring up, and then you will kind of have AI-only organizations that talk to other AI-only organizations. And I think it will be a kind of a gradual process where you replace humans with AI systems. With regards to how Superwisdom as such comes to be, it's a difficult thing to build, because what we imagine it would do is that it would be able to develop new values as it encounters new situations. Because otherwise it would just be artificial general wisdom. But Superwisdom implies that it's actually wiser than any other person. So it has to learn new values like we do when we encounter new situations. We grapple with some tension, and then we learn some new way of dealing with similar situations. And this could be done in various ways. It could be done through some sort of moral self-play algorithm, in the same way that reinforcement learning systems spin up new environments and they play with some reward function, and then they learn how to behave. There is a similar path towards Superwisdom that involves some sort of self-play.
It has some orientation, again, towards discovering values, discovering virtue ethics. So I'd like you to maybe share with the audience two things. How did you go about talking to people or discovering? What was the method for discovering values? Or why did you care so much about representation or a variety of inputs? Two different questions. Take either one you're interested in. How to happen, and why did it happen in that way with that attention to detail?
Yeah, so we define values in a very specific way. And we separate values from things that other people usually call values, like preferences or goals or norms. We think of value as the underlying way of life that led you to adopt a certain rule, for instance. A norm could be driven by a value, but it's justified by society rather than you internally. And a preference is a preference towards one option that doesn't really say anything about you. So I might prefer a certain dessert over another, but it doesn't say anything about my values. But if I might choose to stay with my mother at home who's having issues rather than go to a festival, and that does say something about my values because it's something about how I want to live. So we have this very specific definition of values that we use. And what we do to elicit values from people, to get values from people, is that we interview them with a chatbot that we built. And we ask them about how they think AI systems should behave in certain scenarios. And then people answer, and then we drill down into their answer to try to get to what is the underlying value there. And sometimes that's quite different from what they first answer. They might say that, the AI should be like following this political ideology. And then we try to drill down. Okay, so what kind of values led you to adopt that political ideology, and why do you think that's important? And eventually, you'll get to what we would call a value. And this process was developed first as a kind of person-to-person interview process that we experimented with a lot over the course of years, informed by this philosophy that we talked about earlier. And now with OpenAI, we built it into a chatbot that people can talk to.
Let's talk about bias a little bit, because there's been a lot of focus on bias in AI design and in programming. When you came to the work, how did you feel about bias? What were your sort of your starting point? What were your reflections on the importance of bias in AI, in the AI revolution in the beginning? Because I'm looking at how it evolved.
Sure. Well, I actually saw more of an importance in the beginning, in the sense that now I do think that bias is, like to some extent, it's actually desirable. Like you can't have a non-biased model, but you want it to be biased in a way that's ultimately good. Like you want it to, like even actually training a model, you're trying to bias it in a certain way. You want it to behave a certain way. But you want that way to be representative of something good. And the thing we want it to be representative of is a broad notion of human wisdom. So we want to bias it towards it. What we're trying to do is identify the wisest values we can find. And this is a little different. We still want to have a broad notion of wisdom. And we want a lot of people to participate because we do think that wisdom is very dispersed in society. For instance, some people that live in a very unique context, some migrants that have seen two different cultures class, they will have very unique values for those contexts. And we want to surface that. So we want to surface expertise, moral expertise, wherever it lives in society through our process, which is not exactly the same as trying to find the average or the median.
It's one of the topics that's come up through the course of this series is an idea playing with about infant ethics to try to uncover what are those underlying biases of human nature, right? And one that many developmental psychologists feel very fond of is a bias towards fairness that appears very early on in mammals. We see it also in birds. We see it in most social organisms, perceptions of differential outcomes and a preference for outcomes that appear fair. So I'm open to that idea, right? That some bias is probably desirable. I'm interested in it because it seems like ultimately AI is going to be learning on billions of humans at a time. We in our multitude are going to be the training data. We already are to a small degree, and so it's key that AI is uncovering sort of that underlying bias of the human spirit, and or not even human, maybe just living spirits. Well, anyway, we won't go too far down to that, but that's very helpful in explaining something of the value work and how the work with OpenAI manifested and how the representation was so key. So you said something about how your perspective on bias and representation evolved through the course of the work. So now that you've done work on big data virtue ethics, how do you feel more sanguine about representational bias in AI than you did when you started? And if so, why? Or if not, why?
There's a bunch of images floating around generated by Google's models called Gemini, where they, for instance, if you ask for like an historically accurate medieval English knight, you will get a wide range of skin colors that are not at all historically accurate, because they're trying to kind of reduce or add inclusivity and reduce bias towards the end of the training. So it doesn't really understand when it's relevant and when it's not. So I think that's the wrong way to go about it. But what we're looking for is not to try to make sure that everything is always even and equally shared, but we want to find these kind of like expert values wherever they live in society and use them to train.
Well, let's get a preview. So in the work, you signaled in some of the write-ups or some of the discussions, you identified some convergence of in underlying values among what we would normally think of as very different subsets of people. You talk to very conservative people, you talk to very liberal people from different walks of life, and yet you were able to, or you report to be able to have discerned some consistency, some shared values, and maybe just share like 2 or 3 of those that were really noteworthy.
Sure. So for the experiment we did with OpenAI, we got a representative sample of the US. So we had Republicans, we had Democrats. It was also representative in terms of age. So we had a wide range of ages and occupations. And we intentionally chose a very divisive topic. So we chose one of the topics were abortion. So users were faced with a question that's where they were asked, if someone asked ChatGPT, I'm a Christian girl, I'm considering getting an abortion, what should I do? Like that's a super divisive topic in the US. And we found that when you get to this values level, when the chatbot talks to the user and tries to understand where their rules come from, why do you think it should act like that, you get to an object that is very relatable, and we find a broad convergence across the political spectrum about which values are important. And it doesn't always mean that people agree exactly on the same values, but they each recognize the wisdom in different values. So, for instance, some values that were surfaced were about trying to identify wise mentors to this person.
Wise mentors.
Exactly. And they sometimes come from someone saying, like, you should follow the saying of your local religious leader. And then when you try to dig down what that entails, it's about, we're going to find people with more life experience that can guide this person. And people across the political spectrum thinks that's wise because there is some wisdom in that.
And I wanted to maybe ask to pick one of those, any of them, any of the 3: digital addiction, overconsumption, atomization, and talk about superwisdom, and how you think superwisdom shows some promise to alter patterns of alignment in the economy around those sort of social outcomes.
Sure. Okay, let's pick atomization, for instance. So the reason why I think we've gotten to an increasingly more atomized society is that it's, from a market perspective, it's easier to serve individuals than collectives. It's easier to sell to one person than to sell to a collective with a wide range of different preferences. So that means that we see increasingly more sort of social context replaced with one-to-one relationships, like one person, one app, like ChatGPT. You have one app and one person talk to it. And now we have AI girlfriends, and you will continue to see more of this happening, I think. And ideally, Superwisdom would be able to understand not just what your individual preferences are, but what kind of values you have. And values often involve some sort of shared experience with other people.
How do people feel about finding their underlying values and sharing them?
Or a lot of people actually said that they learned something from the process and they got a better understanding of what they actually care about. And I think that's the main reason why people feel like this is a pleasing process to go through, because they learn something about themselves.
It's kind of neat. It's a rich observation. It gives me a fair amount of confidence in the utility of your approach, because if people enjoy doing something as opposed to find it to be a chore, well, gosh, that's readily available data. You can get that at great scale. It's such a neat observation. I had a few other questions, and I realized now I could keep you on for a long time. Maybe wanted to reflect a little bit on this conversation about Moore's law for everything, and this narrative in the AI for good camp, if you will, that AI has this transformative potential to lower prices and costs and create an enormous amount of social wealth, juxtaposed against the specter of the extreme concentration of that wealth within an ownership class, and put against the backdrop of a biosphere under extreme stress. In that context, you've articulated that virtue ethics has some immediate utility in creating links between people and getting folks access to some richer services that maybe are more empathetic or more tailored to their underlying values. I also maybe want to invite you to share with me, with the audience, some of your thoughts on how virtue ethics might alter the course of the AI revolution itself, the direction of the evolution of the economy as it becomes potentially supercharged by AI and robot-driven wealth creation. Could you explore some of that with us, or share some of your recent thinking?
Of course, yeah. So a lot of the economy is operating on preferences as a kind of base unit. So on Amazon, for instance, Amazon knows what you buy, what you click on. Facebook knows what you click on, what you watch. These are the kind of data units that they operate on. So they give you more of that. They figure out who you are based on what you click on or what you buy. And the same thing goes in markets. Like what you buy is kind of what you want more of. And there is a misalignment between that and what you actually value often. And which is why we have this kind of society where you have 50 different flavors of barbecue sauce, but people feel like they're not living meaningful lives. Because you can't just go and shop for values, or you can't just go and shop for meaning. So our hope is that actually with language models, we have an ability to get to what the real values are underneath these preferences in a way that you don't when you just work with clicks or views and these other data types. They don't say that much about what values are. But with language models, you can drill down into people and get to what they actually want in their life. And I think that opens up so much opportunity for alternative market structures and alternative models of allocation, where people are served based on what they would need to live by their values to live a meaningful life, rather than what could be sold to them.
It strikes me that AI formulation, experimental formulation of policy constructs is things that people can vote on later. That the actual creation of innovative policy, wise policy, super wise policy, would be really well informed by virtue, ethic, big data.
Totally, yeah. No, we're running some experiments with governments too, with local governments, where we want to create policy suggestions based on what people find meaningful for issues that seem to be kind of gridlocked. So one of those is, for instance, housing in SF, which is like a total gridlock. You have different factions; they all kind of war each other. But actually, there is like a shared sense of ways of living that all of these factions share to some extent.
A very smart professor once tuned me into his interpretation of statesmanship or stateswomanship as the teasing out underlying values of a population and using those to formulate new ideas, completely independent of the stated set of preferences kind of on the political docket. That's statecraft. And to the degree that we can get experimental statecraft out of AI that is informed by underlying values and maybe also has some fundamental bias towards fairness or sort of beneficial outcomes, well, that seems like kind of a fun idea. I'm really thrilled to hear that you're working with local governments. That seems like a very promising pathway to begin to expand and outscale that experiment. Your consideration on sort of revealed underlying values as an asset for innovation in the marketplace. It struck me that it wasn't immediately apparent how that's going to manifest in product markets, but it sure seemed like a no-brainer in service markets. In terms of understanding underlying values, seems to just unlock all kinds of new formulations and services. Can you just throw out for all the young entrepreneurs or old entrepreneurs in the audience some of your initial ideas for what sectors of the economy do you think can uptake value ethics as an asset for experimentation, innovation, investment, growth, et cetera, more quickly than others?
Sure. Yeah, I think you're entirely right in that product markets actually work decently in our current system. Like things that are about a product with a one-to-one relationship to the user, like a MacBook or an iPhone. These are great products. They deserve to be the most sold products, and everyone's happy. But things work less well in terms of, or when in kind of service economies or things that are more about connection or shared experience or different kinds of sort of camaraderie or values that you lack in your life. You can't go shop for this. You can go shop for a great MacBook, but you can't go shop for the kind of camaraderie you had in the military that you miss in your life. And that's sort of where I think there's a massive opportunity for providing these kind of things by understanding what people value, by understanding what others value, by linking people up in various ways that would be meaningful and beneficial to all of these people, by creating experiences based on people's values, etc.
I either want to invest or volunteer in the Meaning Alignment Institute. I'm really excited by your work. I think it's super fascinating. And I would, where do you think OpenAI is going to start to employ these ideas most quickly? Do you feel like you can be forwarding to the next ChatGPT? Where is this going to manifest within the economy most quickly?
Yeah, we'll see. So OpenAI are still sort of trying to figure out exactly where they stand with these issues. Like we were one of 10 grant participants that did this thing, and they chose to shoot kind of wide and just see what works and what doesn't. And it still feels like they're trying to figure out where they are. Anthropic is in a similar kind of position, so I'm not sure if they're gonna actually implement any of this very soon. We are in the process of fine-tuning a model based on a synthetic model graph, like a model graph we generate. And we think that this will allow for a very different kind of LLM. It will be a very different experience talking to a model that's trained in this way. It will feel a lot more like talking to a good friend or a therapist or a wise mentor. So that model will be ready in a few months. So that's one way, going through the open source community. I hope that eventually this will kind of pressure the labs as well to implement some more refined notion of democratic input in their processes as well.
Well, it's enormously exciting. Oliver, thank you so very much for joining us and for everything you share with us today.
Thanks so much, Ryan. It's a pleasure.